main person is going to be President Abraham Lincoln will be there. And so that should be fun for everybody, and we'll be having more details about when he'll be speaking and the things that he'll be doing. But anyway, we're working hard, and we could use a lot of volunteers. So if you can help us out with the muster, we would love to know that. Okay, with that being said, oh, I could tell you that next week for Brown Bag Lunch, Ray Scott is going to be here. He's going to be doing a continuation of his program about the Underground Railroad. He's going to be talking specifically about John Brown. Is that correct? So I know that you won't want to miss that. And then we have a couple other really good programs coming up as well. Okay, that being said, I want to thank Sue for our program about living among the Indians. Thank you, Sue.
Good morning. So this kind of some bits and pieces of things that I've come across that I just kind of saved and then finally had enough for a brown bag lunch. Some of the, and I'm sure there's a lot more information out there. It's just, this is what I had like accidentally come across. So these are some are first-hand accounts of people that encountered Indians in our area, and then others are, you know, maybe things that happened in another part of the country, but yet it impacted the people that lived here in Jackson County. So living among the Indians. And shown is a vintage Iowa postcard depicting the Native Americans. Historically, several Native American tribes, including the Iowa, Sioux, Sauk, and Meskwaki, lived in what is now Iowa. And the Meskwaki Nation, which is the Sac and Box tribe of the Mississippi and Iowa, remains the only federally recognized tribe in the state. This presentation includes encounters that our early pioneers had with the natives of the land, some friendly and some not so friendly, to the point of being deadly. And most of the deadly encounters that I'm going to talk about actually happened elsewhere, but it impacted, you know, our Jackson County residences. Advertisement. The grand rush for the Indian Territory. Over 15 million acres of land now open for settlement. Now is the chance to procure a home in the beautiful country. The finest timber, the richest land, the finest water west of the Mississippi. So this article appeared in the Maquoketa Sentinel Press, January 1st, 1938. There were several Indian villages among or near the Maquoketa River when the first settlers came to Jackson County. The last of these was broken up about 1849, but occasional groups of Indians would return to the big forest in the forks of the Maquoketa until Civil War days. The Indians were friendly, but were somewhat of a nuisance to the pioneer women. Occasionally, the Indians would walk silently into the house, and the pioneer woman would look up to see a hungry Indian beside her wanting bread. I just can't imagine what that must have been like for them. Friendly Indians who were so in love with bright colors that they took children's colorful dresses off the clotheslines and carried them away. And those were among the hardships that Mr. and Mrs. Peter Kaler, Jackson County pioneers, faced in the early days. And the loss of 2 or 3 dresses was a minor tragedy in those times, when even the cloth was made at home. The Indians frequently came to the Kaler cabin near the caves to sharpen their knives on the grindstone there. So all bright garments and also flour and cornmeal had to be kept hidden. Peter Kaler, a native of Germany, was married in Maquoketa on November 9, 1856, to Miss Margaret J. Moorhead, who had come here with her family from Richmond, Virginia. They built their cabin 8 miles north of Maquoketa, very near the caves, and raised a family of 6 children. Besides the Indians, wild animals often visited them. In 1892, they retired and came to Maquoketa, where Mr. Kaler died in 1913, and Mrs. Kaler's death followed in 1915. Their obituary stated their 4 living children, all residents of Maquoketa, are Charles, John, Mrs. Nell Ringlip, and Mrs. Luella Hodeball. Eunice Powell was the daughter of Colonel John Powell from Connecticut. She married Simeon Hathaway, and they had 4 children, who all survived to adulthood. Newspaper article, Settler-Aided Midnight Birth by Elsie Eggers. And of course, Elsie Eggers, probably some of you from Andrew knew her, and so she had taken this information, so obviously she didn't live at that time. The Hathaways arrived here in the spring of 1852 from Vermont, along with many other families like themselves. With them, they brought 24 cows, which was a good number in those days, a few horses, and some machinery. These times are related by Mrs. Clarence Jackson of Preston in a newspaper article in 1978, who was the great-great-granddaughter of the Hathaways. She relates that the Native Americans who were supposed to be living on a reservation at this time, but returned to the rivers and streams of Jackson County each summer, and were still in the areas when her ancestors arrived. The same had been true when Colonel R.B. Wyckoff had arrived in September of 1838. He and his family had settled in Van Buren Township, where about 150 members of the Sac and Fox Indian tribe camped along the small grove near their home on Copper Creek. Colonel Wyckoff visited the Indians frequently, as a few of them could speak English. Years later, the Indians camped along the stream north of the Hathaway home, which abounded in trees, especially willows. With the twigs and branches of the willow trees, they wove baskets for carrying food and gathering eggs. Many of these baskets were sold to the settlers. Frequently, the Indians would gather on the Hathaway lawn where Eunice read to them from the Bible and taught them English. One summer, when about 100 of the Indians were camped along the river, the Hathaways noticed that the tribe members were staying longer into the season than usual. One fall night, long after the family had retired for the evening, there came a knock on the door. Upon answering the door, Simeon found an Indian standing in the rays of his lamplight. The young Indian indicated that he needed help at his teepee, and he wanted Eunice to follow him. Simeon was reluctant to have his wife go and said if she went, he would go also. The Indian did not seem to agree with this, and Eunice assured her husband that she was not afraid and was willing to go alone. When she left with the Indian, Eunice took her Bible, a medical book, and a kit and lantern. At the teepee, Eunice assisted the Indian's wife in delivering a healthy baby. Before leaving, she christened the infant. By midnight, she was on her way home. Arising early the next morning, Eunice went to check on the newborn, but found that the Indians had broken camp and were headed westward to their winter reservation. She watched the tribe members as they made their way to the crest of the hill, and among the many ponies and Travises being pulled by the Indian women, she finally spotted the young mother and child. Before disappearing, the Indian stopped and looked back to wave at Eunice, who responded. According to reports, this was the last year that the Indians came to the area. Eunice is buried in the Buckeye Cemetery, Preston. She was a school teacher and had some knowledge of medicine, having many times accompanied the doctor in Vermont on his calls. So with her, she brought a handbook of medicine, the traditional Bible, and a kit containing most of the medicines available in those days. After the Hathaways had arrived, word spread that Eunice had some knowledge of medicine and midwifery. As a result, she was often called upon to give aid to the folks of Van Buren and Iowa townships. Mary Payne was born in 1814 in Tennessee. She married James Holt, shown in the photo, and to this union 8 children were born, the first 3 dying before the age of 1, and the last child lived for less than a year. She died in 1844, 5 miles north of Kitchen Settlement, Jackson County. So I didn't get a chance to look that up. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Kitchen Settlement? Okay. Mary and James were among the exiled Mormons from the state of Illinois. Starvation and disease ran rampant among these new communities. Mary and their youngest son died soon after. 2 more children died. Then he married Parthenia Overton, a young lady that had been asked to help out this widow and his young children. It was said that she fell in love with the 3 remaining children before she did with their father. The couple were blessed with 9 or 10 children. So with his second wife, he had an additional 9 or 10 children. In James's autobiography, he talks about this place will kill the lot of us. He may have not waited for permission to head west. There were maybe 20 people in the entire James Holt company. 8 of them were his family. There was a doctor that had wanted to travel with a small company to California because of the diseases that broke out with the larger companies. The other may have been a returning missionary and his family. They had little trouble with the Indians because of their respect for the bravery to travel in such a small group. But at one point, a young freckled boy was powdered up by the doctor to look like a pox. The Indian took one look at the wagon and lit out over the hills as fast as his horse could run. James lost a large portion of his family with his first wife in a very short time, but then his losses slowed down, though his work never did. He and Mary's remaining 3 children all lived and prospered. And it really didn't say much about them, the additional 9 or 10. David Sears was a very enterprising man and regretted his lack of education, which would have enabled him to become a minister or a missionary. He married Maria Wheat. After their daughter Susan was born, they moved to Kenzua, Pennsylvania, where their 5 other children were born. In the later part of 1831, David purchased 1,000 acres of virgin pine forest and erected a sawmill on the Kenzua River. He did a flourishing business and rafted logs down the Allegheny River to Pittsburgh and other growing towns. It was in this sawmill that his son George lost his hand. In search of new adventures, David sold his holdings, constructed a large raft which had a large cabin, and set out with his family in the spring of 1839 and floated down the Allegheny and Ohio rivers. His first stop was Covington, Kentucky, where he purchased a brick house and 2 brick storerooms across the river in Cincinnati. Then in 1845, tiring of the mercantile business, he sold out his holdings and set out in a covered wagon across the pathless wilderness through Ohio and Indiana. A brief stop was made in Chicago, a squalid and muddy town. While in Chicago, he heard of the wonderful land to the west. He had no time in starting out for this promised land and landed at the site of Maquoketa in the spring of 1845. David saw the prospects of a great opportunity, and having the necessary fortune, spent most of that year in acquiring several hundred acres of land where the Beaton and Seeberger farms were later located, and also a large tract east of the river. He then returned to Covington in 1846, settled his affairs there and in Cincinnati, and in the spring of 1847 he loaded up his family, household goods, and a beautiful top buggy on a steamboat bound for the Promised Land. The buggy, of beautiful design, was painted a combination of blue and red and was the first top buggy to enter the town of Maquoketa. Do we have pictures of that? No. The journey was made down the Ohio and up the Mississippi River to LeClaire, Iowa. They disembarked at this site, secured several teams and cumbersome wagons for their journey to Maquoketa. When they arrived at Goodnow's Tavern, Mr. Goodnow trotted out to greet the party. He was barefooted, his feet and legs were very dirty, and his trousers ragged, which were butternut colored. And they were dirty as well as his blue hickory shirt. So I was kind of surprised to hear that description of him. This setting and welcome had quite an effect on the family. who had lived in comfort in Covington, and the daughter, Susan, burst into tears of resentment at her father for bringing them to such a God-forsaken place. Soon after they settled, he built a grist mill and set up a sawmill, built a bridge and a home. The site that David Sears chose for his sawmill was excellent. To the north and west, there was a vast forest of giant trees for 50 miles or more. Here were found maples, oaks, elms, hickory, butternut, ash, walnut, basswood, cottonwood, willow, and cedars. Many Indians, Sac and Fox, had their teepees in the silent depths of the forest. And so I think where they're referring to is this is just north of town, you know, on the old highway, before you get to Hurstville. At first, or maybe Hurstville was part of it, I don't know how much you know. At first, the poor wives were frightened to see an Indian step through their door. Indians did not bother to knock. They simply stepped in and startled the woman with a gruff howl. It was a friendly greeting, and they caused very little trouble. About 1870, the last of the Indians had gone. Around this time, a band of 50 camped on the north bank of the river, a few yards west of the old brewery. The rivers and creeks were literally alive with fish of many kinds, and 1,500 or more pounds were often pulled upon the bank, with one haul of a 70-foot seam. Muskies and catfish weighing up to 40 pounds were often caught with hook and lines. Theo Ahrens and Tony Goebel attended the funeral of Tony Ahrens and Nick Wolf at White Lake, South Dakota, who were fatally burned in a prairie fire. The Indians set the prairie on fire, and the two gentlemen attempted to fight the fire, but they were unable to escape the flames. Tony Ahrens and Nick Wolf were former citizens of St. Donatus. Anthony was the brother of Theo Ahrens and was the son of Nicholas and Anna Ahrens. And I had talked about those families a little bit on the tragedies of Jackson County, so I think they were involved in that when on the 4th of July, when that powder that they were carrying, and the cigar fell down and it exploded. John Prusia was born in Nebraska Territory and his wife in Ohio. He died in 1876 in Van Buren Township. John had served in the Nebraska Cavalry. During its year of active duty, it rendered efficient service against the Indians. The regiment was called into being on account of the grave menace to the pioneer settlers of the territory, occasioned by numerous bands of hostile Indians who had been plundering and capturing the settlers of western Minnesota during the summer and fall of 1862, and threatened to cross the Missouri River to continue their depredations in Nebraska. In the later part of August 1863, as part of General Alfred Sully's northwestern expedition, it left the mouth of the Little Cheyenne River in search of the enemy. And on September 3rd, the scouts of the expedition reported 600 Indian lodges about 10 miles distant. Preparations were hastily made to attack them the same night, and the bloody battle of Whitestone Hill ensued, the strength of the Indians being estimated at about 1,000 warriors. Both officers and men of the 2nd behaved with great gallantry, resisting several desperate charges, and finally driving the enemy into a headlong flight from the field. Colonel Furness estimated their loss in killed was not less than 150, and their wounded was twice that number. But for the cavalry loss, they had 7 killed, 14 wounded, and 10 missing. And the Indians, in their hasty flight, abandoned all their tents, clothing, and supplies of every sort, and only the exhausted condition of both men and horses of the regiment saved them from further pursuit and punishment at the hands of the gallant 2nd. The victory gained at Whitestone Hill was entirely due to the coolness and courage of the regiment, and came as a fitting close to a hard and toilsome campaign of several months. Did anybody ever read about that? James G. Smith was a blacksmith in Farmers Creek Township. He was born October 9, 1825 in Butler County, Pennsylvania. James married Margaret Schroer in 1849. They moved to Jackson County, Iowa in 1855, where they resided until 1878, and then they started for the Wild West. They located in Decatur County, Oberlin Township. You know, and I guess I didn't put what state that was. They arrived in June, and on September, while putting up hay with his son Watson and neighbor John C. Hudson, James was attacked and wounded by the Cheyenne Indians. He managed to crawl into a plum thicket near the road in a draw that runs down the creek near the northwest corner of Oberlin Township. Does anybody recognize that township as being in Iowa, Oberlin? So he was still alive when found the next morning, but was very weak from the loss of blood, having been shot 10 times. He was loaded into a wagon and taken to his home. And he died that night, and then they took his body into town. So the man that died then is shown on the left with his wife, and then on the right is a picture of their son Watson. Mrs. Mary Vondelay. She moved with her parents in 1839 from Pennsylvania to Jackson County and settled in Andrew. In 1842, she married Jesse Vandelay. Her husband actively served during the Black Hawk War and was in Stilwell's defeat in battle of Bad Axe. Mary and Jesse had 7 children. Son John, who was born in 1854 in Jackson County, was killed by the Indians near Fort Laramie, Wyoming. Her son William also died the same year at Fort Laramie. Mary Vandelaw lived over 40 years in Perry Township. So I'm not sure if her second son was also, possibly killed by the Indians. Sarah McDonald was born almost in hearing of the first gun of the Revolution, and through its wintry wars lived very near where for years its armies were threatening to converge upon each other. After the national peace at her western New York home in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Iowa during most of her life, Indians more than whites were her neighbors. With the Indians of New York, she could talk in their own tongue, and they were so fond of her that it was their delight and their habit to share their berries and game with her. Through an eventful period of the world's history, she had lived. After Sarah was widowed, she and 8 of her children, some with family, came to Jackson County. This story is from a written family history. Charlotte Vrooman was born in Canada in 1828, the daughter of Sir Arnott Schuler, Keister Vrooman, and Elizabeth McCowan, and died in 1891 in Maquoketa. She married Albert Hayner, and to this union 7 children were born. Her last 4 children were born in Maquoketa. Charlotte's grandmother was Margaret DePeister Mattis, who was born near New York. And so her grandmother, when she was about 15 years of age, along with 3 other girls, were taken prisoners by the Indians. She was better treated than the others and was made to waiter the chief's squaw. Thus she passed 2 years following her captors from one camp to another and sharing the trials and discomforts of such a life. Finally, she was rescued by General Adam Vrooman's regiment, and when peace was restored between America and England, she showed her gratitude to her preserver by becoming his wife. 6 children were born to this union. Mary Miller Goodman was born in Jackson County in 1869. At the time of her birth, her parents had 3 girls and 4 boys. And here's a quote from Mary. "My father and his workers were getting tired of the lumber business. Her father, Absalom Miller, at the time operated a logging business at a small settlement called Pinhook. So he decided to make up a covered wagon train to come west and homestead. The government had succeeded in moving the Indians west across the Missouri River, opening this prairie country to homesteaders. As there were no bridges, the streams had to be forded. They would search for a low place in the river which had a gravel bottom. Then the lead wagon pulled by oxen would cross, followed by the others. Sometimes the streams were so deep, their wagon boxes were in danger of floating away. In a couple of weeks, they arrived at what is now Wolf Creek Township. Each family went their own way in acquiring a homestead site. As there were no roads, they followed the ridges. This was all prairie land, no trees, nothing but grass. They tried to dig dugouts using poles from trees along the Little Sioux River. Mosquitoes were so bad, they nearly ate us. Mother often stayed awake all night to keep them off us children. That winter it was cold and there was no wood to burn. We tried twisting dried grass, but that did not give enough heat. Father and the boys then had to drive to the Little Sioux River, a distance of 8 or 9 miles, to cut wood. One day, Father was so cold that he stopped at a double log house on the present site of Amphin. A squaw man and his squaw lived there. They had proved up a homestead as the Indians had gone west. The squaw was sitting on the floor crying because she was so lonesome for the rest of her tribe and she wanted to join them. Father asked what the squaw man would take for his house and farm. And when the man in turn asked Father what he would give, Father jokingly said, that team of oxen, the wagon in the yard. The deal was completed, and in a few days they were in Sioux City, Woodbury County, Iowa, where papers were drawn up and giving Father ownership of a 300-acre homestead on what is now the town of Amphin, Iowa. The house on this acreage was a log house with 2 rooms, a sod roof, and sod banked into the windowsill. There was a pole barn covered with grass, also a cave and a deep well, which from water was hauled up by hand with a bucket and rope. After the deal was closed, Father helped the Indians get ready to move and join the rest of the tribe by building the cover back on the wagon. We moved into our warm log house where we lived for many years. The men got busy in the spring to improve the place and plant crops. In the fall, when I was young, we would see white smoke coming up through the trees near the river. Then we knew the Indians had returned. There were 3 or 4 teepees, several squaws to cook while the men fished and hunted from Ottawa to Cherokee. They did not bother us except to ask for flour, take dead hogs to eat, and steal dogs. They were not savage, but when we saw them coming, we would lock our doors. They would pound on the door and speak in a language that we could not understand. Jackson Sentinel, Maquoketa, May 18, 1854. Pioneer Seneca Tubbs family, and I believe that would be your relation, experienced Indian visit, gave aid to other settlers. Indian could take white squaw's papoose, and white squaw would never see it again. But white squaw, good to Indian, Indian won't do that. This was part of the conversation between Mrs. Seneca Tubbs and an Indian who came to the door of the Tubbs Pioneer Cabin south of Maquoketa more than a century ago. Mrs. Wiley Wilson, granddaughter of Mr. and Mrs. Seneca Tubbs, does not know the exact date of the incident, but the story is a favorite one of her family. Mrs. Tubbs and her tiny children were in the cabin alone, the husband being out working his new land. When the Indian came to the door, painted face and all, he asked for a chicken, which she readily gave him. She was so frightened, she would have given him the chimney off her house if he'd asked for it. Mrs. Wilson comments, the Indian then told her he had learned from a dying chief of his tribe that he was actually a white person who had been stolen as a boy from a family that lived near Preston. But upon finding no information about a stolen boy from persons in that area, he was heading west to join the tribe again when he became hungry. Had you heard that story before? Mildred Burns was the daughter of Hattie Adele Skinner Scott. So I got this information from you. And Harvey William Scott. She wrote memoirs concerning her parents and ancestors. The following is one such account. One day an Indian came into their restaurant and wanted Mother to go away with him as his squaw. "Me squaw," he said to my father, who in turn said, "No, she is my wife." The Indian left without trouble. Mother had very pretty brown eyes and real black curly hair. I believe she weighed about 100 pounds when married. And then another account from that book. Maynard, my brother, and I thought we had come to real Indian country. Not many trees, only flat landscapes. Mother said we acted like wild Indians. We played in the strong winds of central Kansas, my long hair flowing in the winds, and our arms waving like birds. So this quote was from the Ellis History book. When the first white settlers came to Jackson County in 1836, there were several Indian villages in the Maquoketa Valley. When Shadrach Burleson settled in what is now the western part of South Fork Township in the spring of 1837, he found unmistakable evidence of a large Indian village on his claim that had been recently abandoned. Lodge poles were still standing and a camp kettle was hanging over ashes, where cooking had been recently done. Anson Wilson, who at this writing, September 1906, is still living, and who came to the Maquoketa Valley in 1839, says that a short time after he had built his first cabin, an Indian came to his cabin one morning and wanted him to go with him. Mr. Wilson took his rifle and accompanied the Indian. They crossed Mill Creek above the site of the old McCoy Mill. Do we know where that is, McCoy Mill?
Up by Walmart.
Okay. And going in an easterly direction, crossed it again near where Willie's Mill was afterwards built. When they gained the high ground east of the creek, the Indian led Mr. Wilson to a particular point and told him, as well as he could with his limited English, to stand there. Then he walked off 100 yards and motioned to Wilson to join him, which he did. The Indian then pointed to the entrails of a deer that he explained he had shot the day before, right where Mr. Wilson was standing. From there, they made their way to the Indian village, containing about 200 people, situated on the banks of the Maquoketa below Bridgeport. The Indians were very friendly and offered Mr. Wilson share of the dog soup, which they were about to serve, but he declined that part of their fare. But he did accept some jerked venison and some cornbread, which the Indians had got from some of the settlers, and one of the Indians brought him some water in a ladle, and he made out a pretty good dinner. He says the Indians were pretty well provided with food, had plenty of venison, and had large quantities of corn stored up. This they buried in the ground until they wanted to use it. And then they dug holes and put the corn in and covered it up, which made it soft and in good condition. Mrs. Isabel Johnson. Nebraska owes, so this was written about her in the Nebraska history, owes its high standing among the settlers, among the states of the Union, to the high character, dauntless spirits, and perseverance of her pioneers. To them is due her wonderful progress along all lines of endeavor, having transformed the wild prairies into the fine farms, thriving villages, and magnificent cities. Among these brave, far-sighted, and hardy pioneers is the West family, of which Mrs. Johnson is a worthy representative. She was born in Maryland in 1836 and is the oldest daughter of Thomas and Catherine Huffmaster West, who with their families settled on the West Blue in Seward County, at a point now known as West Mills, in 1859. The party consisted of the parents and 6 children, besides a young man who afterward became the husband of Isabel West. The family, founded in the U.S. over a century ago by her great-grandfather, Cornelius West, who came from the north of Ireland and first located in Pennsylvania and later moved to New Jersey. For some years, the grandfather, James West, lived on a large plantation near Pittsburgh. And then 7 years ago, it says he was taken by his parents to Maryland, where he grew to manhood and married Miss Catherine Huffmaster. They left Maryland and moved to Illinois, but from 1852 until 1859, they made their home in Maquoketa. And then it was the following, after that, that they moved to Nebraska. So it says, they have thus been pioneers of 3 states, always going ahead of the railroads. In 1859, the West family started from Jackson County, Iowa for the gold fields, traveling by way of Platt's Mouth, where they crossed the river. There they met a party of surveyors returning from Blue River Valley. And they gave such glowing accounts of the land that Mr. West decided to locate there and make for himself and his family a home. So they left the beaten trail and they came to the locality where Mrs. Johnson then was living in Seward County. And it says the only people on the river were the Vivquains, who had a place near the junction. The West family went up the river until they found a suitable spot, and there they stopped and they built a log house in 1859. When they went, they had with them 5 cows, 4 oxen, 1 horse, 4 wagons, and plenty of provisions. And the first winter they lived comfortably. But in March the following year, the Indians burned their home and nearly everything they possessed. This was the beginning of a long series intended to drive the white men away. But the Indians were unsuccessful, for these sturdy pioneers possessed plenty of perseverance and determination. The Indians stole their cattle, destroyed their crops, threatened their lives, but to no purpose. The second winter, the family nearly starved, having nothing to eat but hominy for 16 days. But they stuck to their home, rebuilt the cabin, and in 1864, Mrs. West built a sawmill and later erected a grist mill, which brought people to their place for miles around and was an important factor in the upbuilding and development of the region. And that was from the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. I'm not sure why we were talking before about Nebraska, if I have something wrong there. William Alexander McFarland. His son, Thomas Lewis, who was born and raised and educated in Pennsylvania, and from there in 1843 removed to Iowa, settling among the frontiersmen of Jackson County. After farming there for a short time, he went to Illinois and worked in the Galena mines, but eventually returned to Jackson County, where he engaged in agricultural pursuits until his death in 1875. Early in manhood's prime, he married Susan Alexander, who was born in Ireland of Scot ancestry, the daughter of an English officer, William Alexander. In their family was a son, William Alexander, whose name introduces this article, and he was born in Jackson County in 1845. So a direct ancestor wrote, during the progress of the war, William Alexander McFarland was captured by the English and Indians, by whom he was held prisoner for some time and forced to run the Indian gauntlet. The McFarland family was related to Lewis and Clark, who made the memorable expedition. So this one, this story about Rebecca Arble and George Pease Daly. Rebecca was born in Pennsylvania, and she died in Canton, Jackson County, and her husband was born in Ohio, and they had 6 children. But this story appeared in the newspaper of their wedding day. And just to kind of summarize it a little bit here, they were about to get married, and an Indian came and stole all of their you know, their wedding stuff, his hat and her dress and all that. And then eventually they were able to hunt him down and they were able to get that stuff back. So it's kind of an interesting story, but it's kind of long. So, but it had said that this guy then, he went to Long Grove, and this guy then was bedecked in the wedding raiment, and he was wearing this wedding beaver hat, and then he had a gold watch on and all this finery. And then he also went taking calico fabric and buttons and trinkets and so on. But then the wedding went ahead and took place, and they did get most of the stuff back. So. Nancy McLean. On her death certificate, she was listed as widowed and a farmer at age 91. Born in Beaver County, Pennsylvania in 1814, and she died May 24, 1905, at the age of 91 years. Nancy was the wife of John Ralston and the mother of 10 children, 5 of whom preceded her in death. And her cemetery stone, shown on the slide, reads, and someone put that up, you know, in somewhat recent years, Nancy Agnes McLean Ralston, Native American Blackfoot. May our Creator keep your spirit in peace. This stone was placed by a descendant of Nancy's. It was said she was adopted by the McLeans. And there are some other stuff about this, you know, on Ancestry that maybe, you know, she belonged to a different tribe, but Nancy McLean was my great-great-great-grandmother on my mother's side, and she is buried in Hickory Grove Cemetery. And my grandfather used to talk about her, you know, he didn't know her, but he would tell people. So I found this quote, and it was written by a Joplin, Missouri resident. I just thought it was kind of humorous. This is Mrs. Hazel Klein wrote, "When I was a baby, and I'm now an 85-year-old woman, my parents moved from Kansas to the Oklahoma Territory, now Oklahoma, near Veneta and Blue Jacket. The Indians were our neighbors, and I remember my parents telling of this incident. One day, an Indian came to the door to ask for something to eat. Food was scarce, but Mother fixed him 2 sandwiches. One was peanut butter and jelly, and the other one was butter. So the Indian ate the first sandwich, the peanut butter and jelly, and then he refused the butter sandwich. And he said, 'No eat cow grease.' And then she went on to say, as a small child, I slept with my parents. One night, Mother woke and found I was gone. The first thing they thought was that the Indians had taken me. During their search, they heard a slight whimper from under the bed. That is where that they found me. In those days, it was customary to lay lots of straw under the homemade rugs to make the floors warm. And that floor was so soft that when she fell out of bed, it hadn't wakened her." Does anyone have any stories that they want to share, or is anyone related to any of those descendants that I talked about that had encounters? Bonnie, do you have any stories to tell? Or?
No, I just always think it's interesting in our history that when people moved to Bellevue, that the poles of from Black Hawk, he had his lodge there, and that the poles were still standing there and everything. So I had hoped when we had the young man from Marquette High School that came, the young lady from Marquette High School who came and we had asked her to do research for us for her senior history project. We had asked her to do research about that to see what she could find out about the Black Hawk Indians that were in Bellevue, and that their lodge was still standing when the white man came. And she evidently wasn't able to find very much about that because she kind of went in a different direction. It gave a wonderful program, but we still know very little about Black Hawk and how he was in Bellevue for a very long time. And just before white men came. So I think that's something that would be great if we knew more about, but we don't. So.
Judy?
This just made me think of this. At Andrew's school, there's a totem pole. Does anybody know why the totem pole's at Andrew's school?
I do. The art people did it as a project.
Okay.
I
didn't
don't know
know
if
if
any of it means anything, but
Okay.
Julie Stevens, I think, was involved in that.
Was that like back in the 70s or 80s?
Well, it was after I graduated, so more in the 80s, I would say. Yeah, they're nothing.
And it's still there?
Yeah, it's still there. We were just there with the grandkids, well, I guess about a year ago now, but by the playground, you could see it.
Yeah, that
I
was.
thought
an
maybe it
art
was
project.
related to all this with the Indians.
Oh, yeah.
That's why.
Sorry. That was a good question.
Blackhawk,
You do? Okay.
because I'm from Lafayette County, Wisconsin.
Do you want to come up here and tell about it? Or?
Sure, Joe. Don't tell.
I don't have nothing to do. Okay, Blackhawk and Lafayette County in 1832, when he got back to Rock Island, the white people, the governor of Illinois, had taken over his lodge. So then he was going up the Rock River to try to find some place to grow corn. And they had a battle in Woodford, but that was, Henry Dodge told a lot of fibs about that battle because actually it was against Kickapoo Indians, not the Sauk and the Fox Indians. And they spent a month up at, they called it 4 Lakes, which is now Madison, Wisconsin. And they couldn't find them, and then they spent a month up in the swamps, up in Hurricane, Wisconsin. And then they corralled the Native Americans over at Bad Axe up by Prairie Sheen. And that was the final battle for them. And then the 150 women or children that did make it back across the Mississippi got killed by the Sioux Indians because they didn't want to marry them.
Thank you.
Well, good summary.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Do you want to?
No, I'll just talk loud.
Okay.
My dad farmed his whole life in Van Buren County, and there was one particular hill, up, a hill field that he plowed and grew corn in that was kind of surrounded by woods, and he used to frequently find arrowheads in that field, dig them up. So as a kid, I always thought, well, there must have been Indians here if there was arrowheads. And it kind of puts visions in your mind of what went on. Did they have a battle there? Probably just hunting deer or whatever. But I just always thought there hadn't been Indians on that land at one time. But I think people find them all over, too.
Well, some people find more than others because they know
4
what
miles
they're
from
for.
Darlington where I live, there's a guy that's got an arrowhead collection, and he's got well over 100 of them. They're over 6,000 years old. The oldest was documented as being 10,000 years old. And they found that this arrowhead comes from New Mexico. Because, the Indians were nomadic.
Sure.
And they just traveled from New Mexico and ended up there.
Anybody else? Yeah.
South of Baldwin, on the farm that I grew up on, was always stated to be a burial ground for the Indians, and we were always asked to stay out of that nest of oak trees because it was held sacred by the Indians. And that is just about 5 miles south of Baldwin. It's now the Lost Nation hunting area is that farm, and that's where you would find that burial ground.
Is that like in the forest reserve then, or?
No,
No?
no.
In Lafayette County, there's over 100 of them.
Is that burial ground at the Lost Nation Wildlife Area towards the south end along a big ravine?
North end.
North end, okay.
North end, about half mile, it'll be about a mile of that gravel road.
Okay.
North gravel road, look straight south and you'd be looking right at the ravine that has that burial ground.
Okay, interesting. When Ruth and I first came back in '74, we went up to the Julian Dubuque Monument, and we had an old fellow that was a member of the Historical Society tell us, have you seen the Sac and the Fox Indian audits for silver? And we said, no, we don't know what you mean. He said, just over the ridge before you get to the monument on the south side, there are old Sac and Fox Indian audits where they would dig into the cliff and find silver and then sell it to lead and silver and then sell it to Julian Dubuque. And trade that item for Dubuque's goods. Yeah, and so we went over that ridge and got on a real sharp rim that you could fall off of, and you could, sure enough, there were 2 or 3 cuts and dugouts into the ridge that went back in 15, 20 foot that might have been 2.5 foot high at the most and maybe 4 foot wide. You could belly crawl back in as far as you wanted to go. We didn't go very far, but apparently
How high up were those?
they were just maybe 30 foot below the road that leads to the monument,
Oh,
and
so-
probably 80 foot above the Catfish Creek bottom.
Oh,
Yeah, but they're there.
wow.
Yeah.
So did you say audit?
They call them audits, yeah.
So what is an audit?
Well, where they would try to find the product that Julian Dubuque wanted, either lead or silver, yeah. Yeah, just primitive mines.
Anybody else?
So will you just remind everybody, and thank you so much, that there are cucumbers back there.
Oh,
Wonderful
okay.
cucumbers, and please take a cucumber or two.
So Bonnie said there's cucumbers in the back there for the taking.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.